Welcome to the Follow the Leaders podcast, where we get a glimpse into the minds and lives of exceptional leaders and hear about their experiences, insights, and strategies for success. On today's episode, we'll hear from one heart-centered, effective leader and hear about their wisdom and perspective. So get ready to follow along. Welcome back. We are in for a treat today as I am joined by a woman with so much impact. Everywhere I go, people are singing the praises of the leader you're about to hear from. My conversation today is with Sarah Young. Sarah is the founder of Zing Collaborative, a leadership development company that works with high integrity, forward-looking companies, teams, and leaders. Sarah is also the author of the book Expansive Impact, An Invitation to Lead in Everyday Moments. I loved this book, and I'm excited to talk with Sarah about it. Sarah works with a wide variety of leaders, from executive leadership teams to construction and manufacturing companies to high-growth startups and professional organizations. Sarah is a former corporate leader, a two-time Ironman finisher, and a certified professional coach through both the International Coach Federation and the Coactive Training Institute. She has been named a top executive coach in her area for several years now. Sarah's company, Zing Collaborative, is a proud member of 1% for the Planet. Sarah, congratulations on all of your success and impact, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Thanks again for having me.
There are so many topics I'm eager to talk with you about, but let's start with your current work. Can you fill listeners in on what your current work life looks like?
Yeah, sure. So I often say that I feel really lucky that I get to work with some of the best leaders and the best companies in the world. And I really do believe that that is true. So most of my work these days is partnering with typically growing companies that are looking at how to elevate their leadership capacity as they reach their next stage of growth. So many of my companies that I get to work with they're making some kind of big leap. Oftentimes they're seeing big leaps with hiring or revenue or impact, and they're really thinking ahead and looking ahead at how do we support the people within our company and how do we support the leaders and future leaders of our organization to get us to where we're going and where we want to be. So that's a big chunk of my work. And I do that through executive coaching and a lot of work with leadership and executive teams through offsites and thought partnerships and retreats and lots of fun work like that. I also have a signature in-house leadership experience that I do within organizations where it's for managers and up-and-coming managers to do a mix of, tactical skills to be more effective in their work as managers and leaders, but then also a lot of peer-to-peer sharing and self-reflection and inquiry. So it's a really, really fun program that people tend to walk out of with really just rich relationships with each other. And then I also do some one-on-one coaching and then periodically some fun events, whether it's a women's circle or a retreat or offsite, or I'm doing an event this coming October with a friend out in New York for business owners. So that's kind of the suite of things that I'm doing these days.
So how did your work evolve? You stepped into this role where you are, a role you created, where you're working with these leaders through development, but what did your career path look like to this point?
Yeah, so I spent a good amount of time in the corporate world prior to launching my company in 2013. So in those years prior to 2013, I had an opportunity to do a lot of different things within the corporate world in a lot of different roles. So everything from project management to people management and people development to spending a couple of years in human resources. And the thing that I got really passionate about in that time was, how can we support leaders to support the people who they are leading and managing? I was lucky to work for an organization where we held people to really high standards, which was awesome because we got to work with, stunning colleagues. And what I found was that sometimes when people were struggling, there was something that was or was not happening with their manager or leader that was maybe contributing to that struggle. So I got really passionate about, how can we make sure that we have the right amount of support for the managers and leaders? Because those people need a lot of support too. And oftentimes we get promoted to a management role because we're really good at our core job. But what the research has found is that being really good at our core job does not actually translate at all to being a good manager or leader. So how can we offer support at that level? So that was where the passion sort of struck and what led me to ultimately make a shift from the corporate world to starting my company in 2013.
I love it. And yes, that is so true. I also wanted to ask you a little bit more about your book. I have many friends and colleagues who have worked with you in the past or are currently working with you either on one-on-one or your events. And across the board, everybody feels so seen and encouraged by you, and they appreciate your creative approach to things and your clear guidance. So when I saw that you wrote a book, I immediately headed to Audible. I'm an audiobook kind of girl, and I downloaded it because I really wanted to get a taste of your wisdom. And I'm so glad that I did. And I'm curious how you decided to take your work and put it into book form. Was that always in the plans, or how did you come to make that decision? Because it seems like a really different product.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for purchasing the book and listening to the book. I really appreciate it. So I would say I've always wanted to write a book ever since I've been really young. So that's been kind of a life goal of mine. But more pragmatically, the reason that I chose to write this book and dedicate the time to it was I found that over the course of having my business for a number of years, there were a lot of things that I created for different clients over the years. So, reflections and worksheets and inquiries and exercises. And I tend to work in a pretty high touch way with my clients. And so I would create something for someone or talk about something with someone, and it would live on for that particular client, but not necessarily beyond that. And so I joked with a friend of mine that I ended up with what we ended up calling 999 tragedies, which was my whole entire Google Drive full of all of these one-time use things that I had created for all of my different clients and projects and programs and offerings and retreats and all of these things over the years. And it just felt sort of unfortunate to have all of these things just sitting there in the Google Drive as part of the 999 tragedies. So that was really the spark that made me think about, okay, what could it look like to take these things out into the world in some way that would be hopefully accessible and easy for people to access and use and implement in their own lives at a really affordable price point, which was the inspiration behind the book. And then that was something I thought about for a number of years. And it was actually a mentor of mine who said to me, when I was talking to him one day, I told him that I wanted to write a book, but I just hadn't been able to find the time to do it amidst all of my client work. And he said, Sarah, he said, if you really want to do something, you'll make time to do it. Otherwise, you don't really want to do it that badly. And so I was like, oh, that's a good point. So after I got that little bit of tough love from him, decided to prioritize that. And then the pandemic hit. And so it ended up being a very good time to buckle down and force myself to finish and work on the book.
I love it. Well, congrats on the major life goal taken off the list. Check, check. I have a similar internal discussion. I work with business owners on the opposite end, on the right as they're starting. I do a lot of one-on-one work with people that, especially moms that are looking to start businesses. And
cool.
I relate to your Google Drive dilemma, and one-on-one work does take a lot of time, and you can only have a certain number of people, help a certain number of people at any given time. So I have a similar internal discussion. I am not a writer in any way, so a book is definitely not in my future, but I think about the same type of what did you call it? 999 tragedies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I love it. So your book is a really important read for those of us who want to keep our hearts in our work. And I read a lot of leadership books and podcasts and everything like that. And I really valued your book because it really kept the heart at the forefront, and I really appreciated those messages. I love the focus on how great leaders learn to adapt the style of their leadership to their specific group and their specific team members, and not just sort of barrel through on their own style. And I'm wondering if you have any advice for a leader that needs to be leading in a different style than what comes naturally to them in order to get more aligned. And on the flip side, how do we know when to draw the line in the sand and stick to our own methods and our own preferences as leaders?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. So I'll actually start with the second part of your question. I would say first we need to start with our values and what I might think of as values and principles. If we're clear on our values, we can show up in alignment with those things, and we can make choices that feel good in relation to our values. So first we have to know what those are. And what I find is that our values don't need to necessarily line up 100% with the values of our organization, but we do need to be able to show up in integrity to ourselves while also being in integrity to the organization. So to me, that would be the first thing of, what are our values and what are our principles and what do those look like in action? For me, a big one that I talk about a lot is the idea of integrity, which I know can be really broad. But when I boil that down, for me, what that looks like and feels like is for any decision that I make and any action that I take, at the end of the day, do I feel like I'm being in integrity to myself, to the other person or other people involved, and then to the greater good? So if I can answer yes to those things, generally speaking, I can feel pretty good about the action or the decision or the commitment or whatever it is. So the first thing I would say is we really need to be clear on our values, and then perhaps a set of principles that we can use to guide our everyday actions and everyday decisions. So let's figure that out first. And then we can start to look at, where is my natural approach serving me? And then where might that approach be getting in my way? So within the book, there are a lot of different reflections and exercises that people can go through to look at that. One of the exercises that I lay out in the book relates to our natural tendency to show up as either a manager, a leader, a coach, or a doer. And so what I find is that oftentimes, again, a lot of people are really good doers. That's how they got promoted to be a manager. But in the situation that we're navigating, or in a conflict that has arisen, maybe that's not what the situation needs. So that's where we can start to ask ourselves, okay, is the thing that I do most naturally, is it serving the situation at hand? And we can practice agility by looking within ourselves and looking at the situation to say, okay, where is my approach working and where isn't my approach working? And then where do I need to adjust accordingly? And I call that aiming low and left, which is something that I learned from one of my teachers many years ago, Sam, which is the idea that if we are naturally, let's say we're naturally a doer and our preference is to put our head down and get work done, for us, that is, if we're aiming a dart at the dartboard, that is high and right. So we're going to aim the dart at the dartboard. And even though we're aiming for the bullseye, the dart is going to go high and right. And that is doer. Put my head down, take it on myself. I'm going to just do it myself because it's easier. So if we're trying to stretch into being more of a coach, what we can do is aim low and left. So when we're shooting the dart at the dartboard, we're actually consciously practicing aiming that dart low and left. And to us, it's going to maybe feel so weird that it feels like we're not even hitting the dartboard at all. It feels like we're hitting the wall, but it's going to help us bring ourselves back to center. So for us, that might look like pausing before we volunteer to just do it ourselves. It might involve asking a question before giving advice, whatever it is. So what I would say to bring your question together would be, number one, we have to be clear on our values and our principles, and those can remain true. So we shouldn't have to compromise on our values and principles, but then we can start to look at our approach and our tactics and where they may or may not be serving the situation. And that's where we can practice agility in our approach while still remaining true to ourselves and our values.
I love it. No, that totally makes sense. And I loved that part of your book. And I completely relate it. Is sometimes so tempting to just kind of, it's just easier, faster to do. But when building a team, it is obviously so important to let them be them too. It's a juggling act, I find. And so I really appreciated your guidance on that, both in the book and just right now. So as I was listening to the book, I was thinking a lot about the balance between over-functioning and reaching new goals. And how, as leaders, do we recognize when things cross over into a zone that's not ideal? I don't know if I want to say unhealthy, but like, we are high achievers as leaders. Like you said, we're high achievers as doers or as coaches and leaders. And so how do we tap in and check in with ourselves to know whether we are starting to overfunction or whether we're just driving hard towards the goals that we set?
Yeah, it's a great question. Just for everyone listening, the idea of overfunctioning, what it means is that most of us have a way of showing up when we are at our best. So these are our strengths and our best qualities. And, they're like who we are when we are the best versions of ourselves. And what I have found is that oftentimes the things that get us in trouble or the things that get in our way are our best qualities overfunctioning. So it's basically too much of a good thing. So when we're talking about overfunctioning, it's like our strengths go into overdrive and in some way that is no longer serving us and it's no longer serving the situation. Some examples would be one of my dear clients over the years who's extremely organized, and she is so good at managing, project managing. She is like one of those people who will get stuff done like nobody else. She noticed that her version of overfunctioning is what she described as kind of controlling or micromanaging everything else and everybody else in her life. So that would be where her amazing strength of getting stuff done or project management might be overfunctioning to try to like control or micromanage other people, not just her own stuff. So for me, my best express, I work in a really relational way. I love to have deep relationships with my clients. That's super, super joyful for me. That can overfunction in the way of having a hard time saying no. If an opportunity comes in and people say, but I really, 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 really want you to do this. It is like so absolutely painful for me to say no, even if it really doesn't work for me. So those are just some examples of overfunctioning and a little bit of context for everybody listening. What I would say is, how do we know? Are we just driving hard or are we overfunctioning? Is to tune into ourselves. So generally what I find is that if we are still in that best expressed place and just working hard or reaching goals or reaching new limits, generally speaking, we still feel pretty balanced and pretty grounded within ourselves. We're working hard or we're stretching ourselves. What I typically find is that if we've gone into the overfunctioning place, there's usually some sort of feeling that has crept in that is not ideal. So it could be resentment toward the situation or the other person. It could be resentment toward ourselves, like, oh, well, why did I say yes to this thing? It could be a feeling of like gripping too hard or holding on too tightly. So, if we've surpassed the place of working hard and we're just like white knuckling it, that might be an indication that we're overfunctioning. So I would say to tune into the feeling behind it. I talk a lot about this idea of clean energy. If we're still in a best expressed place, usually the energy is pretty clean. If we've gone to overfunctioning, there's usually something else in the space, whether it's, again, that resentment or striving or like grinding or gripping too tightly or just showing up in a way that doesn't feel quite as pure or clean. So that would be one thing that I would suggest we could tap into.
I love that. And it almost reminds me of, are you familiar with the Enneagram?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
So how the Enneagram says whatever your type is at its healthiest, and then when you're unhealthy. And when I learned about that, that was my first, I'm a type 2 wing 3, like through and through. So the helper, the educator, the nurturer. And I was actually first offended when I read about how under stress 2 goes to type 8 is the challenger and the martyr and all of that. And it was actually funny around this time. My kids are teenagers now, so they're older, but they were little, and it was like, they were elementary school age, and I was really learning a lot about the Enneagram, and I really felt seen by this type 2 description. And then it was bedtime that night, and my kids were not going to sleep, and I was exhausted, and I had been by myself with them all day, and it was just one of those difficult days. And I said to I don't even remember which kid it was, but I was like, after all that I did for you today, after all that you just can't, and I was like, oh, I sound like a type 2 under stress right now.
Totally. Yes.
So it's that sort of awareness. I appreciate you pointing out about just kind of checking in and figuring out where you are at your healthiest. And it reminds me also of 2 pieces of wisdom that I got at totally different parts of my life. One was actually, and I go to this story a lot because I keep on thinking about this a lot at these days, is when I was in childbirth with my oldest, one of the nurses said to me, "You don't get a badge for suffering." And that really, like, when you were talking, it reminded me of that sort of moment where it's like, well, what do I need in this moment? And you don't get a badge for suffering. It's so true. Like, why do we sometimes white knuckle our way through? So, and then the other was this reminded me when you said the clean energy, the other was at a kids yoga teacher training many, many years ago. One of the trainers that was there talked about the energy exchange, and money is one form of energy, but there's all these other intangible forms of energy also, and how it explains why you could teach an event for free and can feel so great about it because you're getting some sort of energy back in exchange. Or you could teach an event and get paid $5 less than you think you should, and it brings up all these icky feelings inside of you. And it's because that energy exchange wasn't balanced. So it kind of reminds me of this clean energy of what you're saying. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you meant, but it's a good checkpoint to say, how is my energy feeling about this situation? And maybe it's not a tangible explanation of why it doesn't feel quite right, but it's important to listen to that. So yeah.
Yeah, those are great examples.
Well, thank you for bringing back those
Of
memories for
course.
me. So, how do you balance being a human that is just figuring it out as you go with the responsibility of leading your own team and being seen with the one with the answers, not just for your own company, but all of these other high performing companies that you guide and coach?
Yeah, well, the great thing about coaching from my perspective is that we don't have to necessarily have the answers. And what I love about a coaching based approach is that we get to bring the answers forth out of others. So, one of my favorite things to do in the whole world is to do that with groups and do that with teams and groups of executives and others when I'm working in a coaching context with my clients. So, my hope is that I don't have to be seen as the one with the answers, so to speak, like the with a capital T, but rather that I can show up in a way that is holding space and facilitating conversations and creating safety for the right conversations for those answers to come through.
Do people expect you to have the answers? And that's something you have to kind of retrain when you work with them? Or by the time they get to working with you, they expect that you're going to more guide them rather than answer their questions?
Occasionally, people will ask that. I did just get a question recently from a group that was considering working together along the lines of, well, how are you going to come in and tell us all the answers when you don't know our industry as well as we do? And it's like, well, the cool thing is I'm not going to do that. And I don't have to know your industry as well as you do. But I would say in general, I spend a pretty good amount of time up front with potential clients talking about their needs and their goals. And I would say for the most part, people get a pretty good understanding of my approach during some of those conversations. And then most of my work comes via referrals. And so what I find is that the types of people who resonate with my approach tend to refer other people who resonate with my approach. So by the time they get to me, oftentimes someone trusted to them has told them, hey, this has worked for us and it might work for you too. So I would say that the combination of those things, the discovery work up front and the conversations that we have up front, along with those trusted relationships via the referrals, help to set some of those expectations.
That totally makes sense. If we zoom out a little bit and look at the bigger picture of your story, do you have any examples of how you gravitated towards leadership as a child, or is this more of something that you have entered as an adult?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say yes, in general, thinking back to, I guess my parents always tell me that even when I was really, really little, like 2 years old, I liked to answer the phone, and I had a very professional way of answering the phone. And they taught me to say, if they weren't available, no, I'm sorry, she's not available right now. May I please take a message? And so I think there were certain things I did from a young age. I'm an oldest child. And so playing school with my brother, I always wanted to be the teacher, not the student, so there were some of those things. And then I guess from a pretty young age, I also really loved facilitating experiences for others. I taught swimming lessons and I taught water aerobics and I taught Spanish to kiddos and different things like that, where I guess I was often in the role of facilitating some sort of experience where there was a learning outcome, whether that was swimming or speaking Spanish or whatever that might be. So I would say that there were threads of that, stemming back fairly early on.
I love it. That's so great. So your book is filled with some of these messages, but I'm curious for listeners who haven't yet read your book, although everybody should, can you think of an example of a time that you learned a leadership lesson the hard way?
One that jumps out related to your question was and I read about this in the book, and I would say this is one of the ones that horrifies me most to this day. I have mostly worked through it, but it's still really embarrassing to talk about. So there was a period of time when I was working with a team, and within the team, there was sort of this subculture of snarkiness. For the team, it was a way of bonding and connecting. They had a lot of snark with each other, and it was just kind of their love language, so to speak, was snarkiness. And I came in as an outside person to work with this team. And my approach is very different than that. I'm not a snarky person. I don't always even it doesn't connect for me as well. And it was very obvious that my approach and their approach was pretty different. And so there was this one email that I was sending, and in what I would call in hindsight a very desperate attempt to try to connect with this team, I infused some snark into my email. And long story short, the email not only went to the team, but someone on the team had forwarded it around, and it ended up getting forwarded beyond the team, and it ended up making it to a very senior level leader in the company. And I was so horrified, A, that the email landed in this person's inbox, and then B, that I wrote the email, and then C, that I, was trying so hard to connect in a way that really wasn't authentic to me. So this goes back to your earlier question of how do we know when to shift our approach versus when to stay true to ourselves. And so to me, I had tried to shift my approach so much that it actually stepped on a value of mine related to kindness and compassion and authenticity and all of these things. And it was like one of my low points of leadership, I would say, just because I was like, Sarah, what are you doing? And like, why would you try to do this? That was definitely one of many lessons learned. But pulling from that, it really goes back to your question of like, I stepped on one of my own values in an attempt to connect with others. And, that was a very poor choice.
Well, thank you for resharing that embarrassing moment. The message in it is very valuable. So I appreciate that. So if you could give yourself a message for your first day in this line of work with the wisdom that you have now, what would that message be?
I guess one that comes to mind is around being clear. So what I mean by that is, since starting my company in 2013, the hiccups that I have had often tie back to not creating enough clarity at the beginning with clients or projects. And so I think this goes to the overfunctioning piece. Sometimes the way that my relational way can show up in an overfunctioning way is being very accommodating to different requests, and occasionally at the expense of being clear as far as, okay, what exactly is in scope, or what exactly are we agreeing to, or what exactly are your objectives, or who exactly is the decision maker here? So I would say that's something I've really grown with over the time of having my company. But if I could go back, to the beginning of starting my business, I think really grounding in that idea of being clear and being willing to have the courage to do so, because sometimes that means taking a step back. Sometimes it means having a harder conversation. Sometimes it means pausing and saying, hey, wait a second. I don't think we're on the same page as far as what you guys are expecting, what I'm expecting, what this is going to look like. So that would probably be one. Have the courage to be rigorous in creating clarity up front.
That is a great message and a great reminder. I have a few little bit more rapid fire questions to ask as we finish up here. Does anyone come to mind that you could shout out who believed in your leadership skills, maybe even before you did?
I have a manager who I had when I was working in the corporate world, and he was awesome about, I would say, believing in my leadership skills before I did. So at the time, I don't think I fully realized it until I looked back in hindsight. But whenever there was a team that needed help or needed support, he was always suggesting me to go in and be a leader of that team. And at the time I was like, man, why do you keep sending me all these teams that need all this help? And in hindsight, I realized he really did believe in me, and he trusted me as a leader in that context. And he was really pushing me to take on these new challenges. And yeah, I'm extremely grateful for that. It allowed me to do a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts due to his nudging.
I love it. Is there personally one tool or strategy that you use to stay organized and effective with all the different projects that you have going on at all times?
So as my wonderful team member, Maureen, would probably tell you, I have a visual brain and not always a linear brain. And so it is not always natural for me to put things in order, A, B, C, D, E. A couple of tools that we use Trello to organize our projects, which works pretty well for us. We actually, both of us have a pretty visual mind. So that allows us to move things through the process of the backlog, to do, in progress, and done. I would say also just finding the right team and team members has been huge for me. I feel really grateful right now that I have a few coaching partners on the team and a wonderful business support team member. And the combination of those people have been really, really helpful. So not necessarily a tool, but I would say hiring the right people and having the right people on my team. That's another area where I've learned and grown over the years, where at different points of time that's been easier than others, but that's been really, really, really helpful and flowing well these days.
I have a very not visual mind, a very linear
Oh,
mind.
yeah.
So I've tried Trello and all the other ones, but I settled on Notion because I can make my spreadsheet and my database and checklists and workflows and everything like that. Besides your own, is there a favorite leadership book or podcast or resource that you find yourself going to?
The one I often cite, which is old school classic, is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I feel like if people are only going to read one leadership book, if they read The 7 Habits, that would be a really great place to start. A lot of timeless wisdom that has been distilled in a lot of other ways more recently. So 7 Habits for sure. The other resource that I would offer is not really a leadership book per se, but I find it so helpful. Anything by Tosha Silver, Tosha. And I would recommend her work if you're feeling like you are really like grinding or pushing up against a wall, or you're efforting really, really hard in a way that maybe isn't yielding the response you'd like. And she has a lot of just really beautiful wisdom in her work about trusting the flow of life, but not in a way that's cheesy or all about just like manifesting and taking no action. But it's one of those where you can pick up one page at a time and read it, or even a sentence at a time. And it's very inspiring, and it's very like grounding. So hers is one that I would recommend. And I would probably recommend starting with her book called Outrageous Openness.
Ooh, okay, I will definitely check that out. That sounds extremely intriguing. Thank you. All right, last question. If you had a day off, like totally off, where you could not accomplish any tasks or to-dos at home or at work, what is one activity that you would do and one place you'd go to have something to eat?
Ooh, that's a fun question. Okay, one day completely off. One thing I would do would definitely be time outside. So probably start the day with some kind of walk or bike ride or something like that. And I'm a morning person, so I would say it would probably also involve going to brunch, probably like a lingering brunch of some sort versus a late dinner. So probably lingering brunch and some time outside.
Awesome. Love it. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all of your wisdom, and everybody should read your book. We'll definitely link that in the show notes. Where can the listeners find out more about you and your events, or if they're interested in reaching out or potentially working with you? Where can they do that?
Yeah, so the best place would be my website, which is zingcollaborative.com, ZING collaborative.com. And on there, they can find out, more about my work and working together. I also send out a Friday newsletter every Friday morning. It's called Friday Favorites. And for now, that's completely free. I have not jumped on the paid Substack bandwagon at this moment. So it's just a totally free newsletter. And folks can sign up for that via the website. It's just the same website /Friday Favorites. So those would be the best places to connect. Friday Favorites is the one place that I really love to connect with the community, much more so than social media. And then the one social media that I'm a bit more active on is LinkedIn, also under Zing Collaborative.
All right, great. Well, we will link that all. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I loved our talk, and thank you all for listening. And we'll be back next time with another inspiring interview.
Thank you so much, Jamie.
Follow the Leaders is produced by Lit Path Studios, and music is by Shane Ivers. You can hear more about this show and all the other podcasts at Lit Path Studios by going to www.litpathstudios.com.